Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us for part 2 of SACAC's Mini Camp College. This week's topic is on standardized testing, and we have some great presenters lined up to talk with you all today. But before I introduce them, I just want to go over some housekeeping things. We're so excited to have you all today. Unfortunately, in Zoom webinar, your cameras and audio are turned off, but we still want to interact with you and we still want to answer all of your questions. So you may see a little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to click on that and submit any questions that you may have throughout the entire presentation. Hopefully we'll answer most of them, but we will take time at the end to answer your questions in Q&A. But with that being said, I would love to now introduce our presenters that we have today. So 1 second as I bring them all up. Okay. Dr. Al?
Hi.
Do you want to go ahead and give a little introduction?
Oh, sure. I'm Dr. Al Benthal, and I am a professor of English at Belmont Abbey College, and I'm also the founder and owner of Benthal Test Prep. So I do SAT prep, ACT prep, and GRE prep here in Charlotte.
Wonderful. Dr. Ari? Oh, sorry, you're muted. There we go.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ari Mukherjee. I'm a professor at UNC Charlotte. I also am the founder and CEO of Hitchhiker's Guide to College Test Prep. We work with students in the SAT, ACT, GRE, GMAT, LSAT, and it's a great opportunity to be here.
Thank you. And Amy.
Hi all, I'm Amy Hall. I'm the Associate Director of Southeastern Recruitment for Dickinson College, which is a small liberal arts college in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, but I am based down here in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Wonderful. So we will go ahead with the presentation. 1 second. Like I said, this topic is on standardized testing. So we have some great individuals, some test prep counselors, some admissions counselors that'll be able to speak on this topic and answer all of your questions. Here are all the presenters again and their titles. And with that being said, I will let you guys take it away.
The first topic we are going to discuss today would be the value of standardized testing. One thing that we, both in the admissions and in the test prep companies, we understand is that the departments cannot ignore a SAT or ACT score if you were to submit it. And that exists across the entire spectrum of college admissions. Inequity exists across the education system. And there have been a lot of comments and news out there saying the test prep, either for the SAT or ACT, only benefits people who are economically well off. But there is another way to look at this, and that is that people who are indeed well off, they can actually go ahead and hire 10 different tutors for 10 different courses that they may be attending. And people who are not able to do that would then be at a disadvantage. Standardized testing provides you with a unified platform. It's a great equalizer because that's one test that you can really focus on and show that you are as good as anybody else. It's also a very fair assessment tool because standardized testing is offered across the board to every student all over the world actually. So if you look at standardized testing, you can take away things or inequalities where there may be a school which may be going easy on the grades or a school which is going very difficult with their grades. Any kind of personal equation that may be affecting your scores, either positive or negatively, do not arise for standardized testing. So we believe it's a very fair assessment tool. Although it's optional, as with anything else in your college application, remember, optional always means it's strongly recommended that you submit it. Otherwise, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. Standardized testing scores, if they're good, they actually help you offset low GPAs. And we see students regularly who do not do so well in a structured high school curriculum, but they're very effective, very smart, and they're good with their analytical abilities. So if they have a low GPA, having a high standardized score will offset your low GPAs. Also, if you have a good GPA, there's no harm in providing a good standardized score to help augment your chances of getting into colleges. Next slide.
So building on what Dr. Ari said, this question arises, what does test optional mean? I'm sure you've all been hearing a lot about this lately. It's been in the news the last few years, but now with COVID-19, you've heard lots of schools going test optional. And I was actually getting a lot of calls from parents on this question. They were seeing these misleading headlines, such as the ones you see below. The SAT has been scrapped, now what? Or colleges are ditching the required admissions test, dropping the SAT. And parents were calling me and saying, Dr. Benthal, does this mean my child doesn't need to take the SAT? And I was actually getting questions like that from students as well. And they thought that the SAT was just over because it sounds like that from the headlines, but that's not what test optional means. So what we need to do is understand the difference between test optional and test blind, okay? Those are two different things. Test optional is what many of these schools have done. I like to say when a school goes test optional, they're cracking the door open to say, if you are an exceptional student with great GPAs, great recommendation letters, great extracurriculars, and you simply have low test scores or no test scores even, maybe you're in an underserved community and it's not available, we want to consider your application and you just might get in. It does not mean cracking the door. It does not mean opening the floodgates or lowering the standards, you understand? So test optional schools still actively consider the SAT. It's not sort of something that's on the back burner. Many, if not most of the students are still submitting SAT scores. That's very important for you to understand if you want to be competitive. Now, test blind schools are schools that do not consider the SAT at all. So you could submit a perfect SAT score of 1600, perfect ACT score of 36, and they simply won't look at it. Now, so that is what we have to understand, that difference. If a school is test optional, it still means strongly encouraged to submit SAT scores. And that becomes even stronger when we look at the next slide and see the numbers behind the test optional movement. So this really began as a movement around 2004, although there were some schools who were doing it as much as 10, 15 years earlier. But many schools began going test optional in 2004, as I say, cracking the door to allow these exceptional students to apply from underprivileged, underserved backgrounds. They wanted to increase diversity, all very good things to do. But let's look at the actual numbers. So there are 5,300 colleges and universities in the US at present. That's a rough figure, it changes every year. Of those 5,300, 1,300 approximately are test optional. Okay, so that gives you a sense of how big the movement is. That's about 24% of schools in the country are test optional. 76% still require the SAT or ACT. So think about that. You know, what are your odds? You got to find out if the schools to which you're applying actively require it. But even if they're test optional, as we've been saying, you're still strongly encouraged to submit because it gives you a definite competitive advantage. Now, if you want to know about test blind, at this point, and this is changing, you know, daily, but only 4 schools in the country are test blind at present. 4 out of 5,300, that's 0.001% are test blind, meaning they will not consider the SAT. We might be seeing a little more of that coming up, but it's still a very low percentage. Okay, so again, the takeaway from that is, given these numbers, you are still much better off to take an SAT or an ACT and take advantage of that competitive edge. So I think yes, Amy Hall is going to talk to you about some more numbers on test optional policies in schools.
Yes. So what does it actually mean to say a school is test optional? Is it truly test optional? Is that an optional word truly mean what you think it does? To give you a great example of what this has looked like in application, in 2018, one of the top 10 national universities and one located in the Midwest went test optional. It was considered that it was going to be kind of the forerunner to seeing major big name universities going test optional. But were they truly test optional? Are you as an applicant best served by applying under that policy? Well, maybe not. If you look at the numbers, only 10 to 15% of applicants for that school use that test optional policy. So it really was a distinct minority of students who were doing that. To present a counterexample, Dickinson College, the institution I work for, was the third in the country to go test optional. We went test optional over 25 years ago. So we've had 25 years to build a marketing strategy around being test optional, 25 years to convey the message and to implement it as part of our system to be test optional. And even with those 25 years, last year only 25% of students who applied, and I can give you the breakdown for that, 53% submitted the SAT, or 52% submitted the SAT, 23% submitted the ACT. So that means only 25% chose to apply under that test optional policy. So even with this long-term strategy of using this, it's still, again, the minority of students who are taking advantage of that policy, which means that when you're being measured, yes, your scores might not be being taken into account, but many of your peers are still submitting them. So it's, the policies, with these policies, those who submit versus those who don't, generally you see a similar acceptance rate, but it is, again, a minority of students who are doing this. So should competitive students submit their SATs or ACTs to test optional schools? Yes. Without a doubt, yes. It opens up many doors for you, and it definitely plays a factor, or plays part of the equation for college admissions. And I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, next slide, please. So how do colleges utilize scores? What does the admissions perspective look like on this? Many schools, Dickinson included, use a holistic approach. So what that means is that your scores are one factor amidst many in looking at your application. Those other factors include your grades, your transcript, your GPA, letters of recommendation, your essay, your activities, but your scores are absolutely a part of that equation if you submit them. I would like to reiterate something that Dr. Ari and Dr. Al have both said, which is if you submit your scores, we are looking at them. So be mindful of that. If you have a score that, with some prep, you could bump up 600 points, that's gonna help you out. The other factor, the other area in which scores come into play is in merit-based aid and in merit scholarships. Many merit scholarships, even at test optional schools, require that you submit a standardized test score. So if you have a strong score, not only is that going to help you in the admissions process, but it could open up some doors in terms of financing college. And all of this leads back to the importance of standardized testing, even in the idea and the system of a test optional environment. So you really do need to prepare for tests and learn the material before you take those tests. And so doing so helps you get ready for what a college environment might be like. Then the last topic I want to talk about from the admissions perspective is this idea of the middle 50% scores. You're going to see this on a lot of college websites. They'll tell you, oh, our mid-range score for those admitted is for the SAT is a 1230 to a 1340. That's a big range. And that doesn't mean that everyone has that or that's the average. That is taking all the scores, laying them out on a spectrum and saying this is the middle chunk. So keep in mind the difference between what a middle 50% is versus an average. An average is all the scores, including the highs and the lows, all combined together and divided amongst the number of applicants, the number of those admitted. Those are two distinctly different ranges, and the colleges generally advertise the middle 50%. But all this goes back to, again, to how scores are used in the application process. For holistic review, it's one factor. Amongst many, it's taken within the context of the rest of your application, but there are also other types of schools, usually larger state institutions, where it's part of an equation. So having a strong score, you can see will have a numerical and direct impact on your chance of admissions. Next slide.
We are midway through the presentation, and I believe some of you may be experiencing some kind of internet instability, but no worries. This session entirely is being recorded, and I'm sure to post it for people to go over it later on. So in this set of slides, the next one, we'll be talking about the difference between the SAT versus the ACT, as well as some of the ideas we have and pointers we have towards test prep. Nationwide, my observation has been about half the students are doing okay with the SAT, the other half does better with the ACT. So there's no clear-cut distinction as far as the weightage of the two tests go. And that's why you'll see reflected in most colleges, they will accept either or the two scores. But this slide, we have tried to capture the primary differences between the two tests. The SAT is a slightly longer test compared to the ACT, but for all intents and purposes, they're pretty similar. The SAT is indeed a slower test compared to the ACT. So in the same amount of time, you'll be answering fewer questions for the SAT, but a lot more questions for the ACT. The focus of the SAT is narrow, but the questions are much more in-depth and more difficult, in my opinion. The ACT, on the other hand, is more superficial. It's going to cover a broader range of topics, but the question depth is not that much. So it doesn't drill into and make a very difficult test for you. However, you will be running against the clock much faster in the ACT. Both the tests have reading comprehension as well as English grammar. The SAT calls it writing, the ACT calls it English. And both of them have math. There is a math no calculator section in the SAT, whereas in the ACT, you can use the calculator throughout the math section. For the SAT, part of the math section, you can use the calculator. And then there is also a science section in the ACT, but no science in the SAT. The science in ACT is not really going to delve deeply into your high school science curriculum. You just have to have basic knowledge of physics, chemistry, and biology. But the science passages in the ACT look a lot like reading comprehension, so that you could actually use your techniques for reading comprehension for solving science problems with a flavor of science. So instead of giving you a humanities passage, they'll give you a physics or chemistry or biology experiment and ask you questions on that. Next slide. We can move on to the next. Okay. So here are some of the guidelines we have for the test prep. And after I was going to elaborate more on this. First of all, when you decide to go for a test prep, get a vision and a mission in your mind. Know what you want to do, where you want to go, what your career would look like roughly. And that will help you decide on a set of colleges. And from that, you'll get an idea of the scores that you need to get. Also, the specific tests you might be interested in prepping for. So there are colleges which are going to ask for SAT or ACT scores, but on top of that, they might also ask for subject SAT scores. So getting a vision behind a mission helps you a lot in knowing what tests to take, what scores to shoot for, when to start prepping, and so on. Now, one very important component of your test prep is managing your time. I know you all have very busy lives. You have curricular and then extracurricular activities, and you cannot increase the number of hours in a day. So you have to manage your time better and find some time within every single day to sit down and go through your test prep, meaning college entrance test prep. So there are students who find half an hour every day, and there are people who find even more than that, an hour every day. Half an hour is pretty effective if you can put all your effort in that one bucket, and also try to manage your environment while you're actually going through this prep. Ideally, you should find yourself a quiet room, turn off your phone, get away from distractions, and that regularity and familiarity of the environment will help you achieve a lot more than you believe. There are lots of study resources, which we have categorized into 4 categories here. The first one is you can take advantage of free resources on the internet. Example would be Khan Academy. It's a good collection of material, maybe not as in-depth as some of the more paid options, but it's a good starting point. You also have automated resources where there are AI softwares on their websites. You log in, it will do the job of your tutoring at a much reduced cost compared to options C and D. An example of that would be Intel Prep. Then group sessions are conducted by big companies like Princeton Review, Huntington, Kaplan, these companies. And then there are personalized tutoring services provided by me, Dr. Al, and individuals who are very custom oriented. They design the courses specifically for the students too, and they're very goal oriented. And finally, a lot of students have been asking us about timeline. How many attempts should I make? When should I start? When should I end? My suggestion is make at least 2 to 3 attempts to increase your super score. Super scoring is a relatively recent phenomenon. What happens with super scoring is you take multiple tests and the colleges will look at the top scores in the individual sections across all the tests. So it makes a lot of sense to actually make more attempts, but all these attempts should be sincere attempts. You should not just go and try to wing it, work hard for the test and make attempts. And the higher the rank of the institution that you're applying to, you will see that the median number of attempts actually increase. It is not unusual to see people make 5 attempts in really top ranked colleges, which also tell these colleges a lot about your perseverance, and they can figure out that this student has kept on increasing the super score after these attempts. So this student can be relied upon. So there is an urban legend saying don't make more than an X number of attempts. I would say if you feel confident about making the next attempt and you have put the work behind it, go and make that next attempt. People start early. It's a good idea to start when you are anywhere between freshman and rising junior time, because that gives you at least to actually work on this. A lot of these tests are critical thinking building, and it is not cramming. So even though people can get away with doing a lot of cramming in high school courses, you need to really be able to think innovatively, accurately, effectively in a very short time period of 30 to 45 seconds for every question. So this is a new skill set that gets built up, and you should start early. And of course, the absolute latest time by when your score should be in should be by the end of your junior year, because after that you are applying. And still, I would say if you need to make any attempt in senior year, those attempts still come in the rising beginning of the senior year. When it's fall, you're making attempts, the college counselors will be able to see your scores and make their decisions typically end of the year, early next year. So you're still okay, but that's a very high pressure situation. It's a good idea to get your scores in by the end of the junior year. Okay, next slide.
Okay, building on what Dr. Ari just said about getting a vision for your test prep, this is something I talk a lot about with my students. What we need to really make a nice increase on the SAT or ACT, we need a system, not just a goal. Anyone can have a goal and say, I want to get a high score, right? But you can't, many of my students have tried this. They go and buy the big fat test prep books, right? Like the official SAT prep guide or the official ACT prep guide. And they will hammer out some tests and they find their scores are not going up, right? Well, that's because they have a goal, but not a system. So we need to put a system in place. And this is something that nobody really tells you in high school, or very few people tell you, right, is how to train yourself to get better. There's a method to do that. And it's important that we know what that is. And I've written some blog posts about this on my website. But I like to use what I call recursive learning, and that's a fancy term. That just means having a system for knowing where you need to focus your work. So you do some problems, you see what you missed, and you categorize those problems, you know, on a sheet of paper or something, or on a document. And you know, okay, well, for example, if your struggle is grammar, English grammar, you have all these categories, for example. What are semicolons? What's apostrophe S? What is parallel structure? These concepts you've heard about in grammar. And if you know that you keep missing problems in, say, using colons, then before you go and do the next homework or the next training, you go back and review all those colon questions together. Oh, I see how they work now, right? And then you jump into the next practice session. Ah, there's a colon question. I'm going to knock this one out of the park. So you see, you have a system for review. It goes in a circle. That's what recursive means, and circling back and circling back. And that will really make your progress, accelerate your progress dramatically over a short period of time. I say that you need at least 6 weeks of training for the SAT or ACT, around 4 hours per week prior to the test. You can put it on a couple of different days, say 2 hours on Tuesday, 2 hours on Thursday. And it's that training. And I like to say it's training more than studying. People say, I want to study for the SAT. I say, why don't you train for the SAT, just like a sport? Think about it as an athletic skill. Many of you are athletes, right? You have to go out, you have to get proper form, and that's where you can take advantage of some of the resources Dr. Ari was talking about. Many good free resources out there. And then when you get your form right, then it's repetition, right? Getting the new muscles to work and getting them stronger and faster. So we can increase our skills rapidly if we have a good system for doing that. But it does take time. So you can't cram for the SAT or the ACT a couple of days before. And you're really smart to get started as a junior. And take it 2 or 3 times throughout the year. But even if you're a senior right now, you can probably take at least a couple of different tests, August, and then they have one at the end of September, October, beginning of October. So at least a couple of different test dates, and treat the test as a learning tool. So in other words, take the test. What did I learn from that? Go take it again. It is not one and done. And it's really important to remember that, because think of the pressure it puts on you to think this one test, determines my whole future. That's an incredible amount of pressure, isn't it? So if you stop and say, wait, I can take it 2 or 3 times. I'm going to relax, do my best. I can take it again, maybe even the 3rd time. I will relax in the test. I'll probably do well, and I don't have to take it again. But by giving myself a safety net, I reduce the pressure on myself. So think of it that way. These are helpful ways to think about the test. Very important also to use only official SAT or ACT prep materials. As I said earlier, the official SAT study guide or the official ACT prep guide are actual SATs and actual ACTs that have been used in the past. And they just take them and sort of recycle them for prep. So you're taking real tests that actual students have taken. Many other companies have put out some good books on this, and they're not bad, but they're also not quite as authentic, as the real stuff. If you get books from another company, they will probably be either a little too easy or a little too hard, or just feel a little different. And when you get on the real test, you're going to feel that slight difference. Oh, this feels sort of strange. Whereas if you've been taking real SATs or real ACTs with the real guides, oh, no problem. It feels just like the real thing, and you're good to go. And I also say here, if you're going to look into some test prep with some different companies and many good resources out there, check into the testimonials from students on the websites. The references, you can actually get references. You can call up and say, can you please give me reference of a student who's taken your course? I want to see what kind of increase he or she got. And that's a fair question, right, on your part. Sometimes you'll see testimonials on websites that say, oh, my tutor was very nice. Well, that's good. I'm happy you had a good experience. But did you get the numbers right? So look for the numbers. And as I say, numbers don't lie. Another very important thing here to mention is that many of these good companies, even if they are for paid services, they will offer you scholarships. If you talk to them about your situation, there are free prep programs available. There are discounted programs available, but you have to ask. You have to go out and make inquiries, and you'll find out that it's not as daunting as you think. So there are some great doors to open. But again, look for the consistent score increases with these companies. The numbers don't lie. Next slide, please. Now, a few more thoughts on test prep during COVID-19. I think that many of you can relate to this problem. Many of you had Zoom classes or online classes this past semester that were not so good. And I think that a lot of your teachers were trying really hard, to do a good job, but they just weren't prepared for it, right? It just hit them, in the middle of the semester. So some of your online experiences were not so good. And so people are wondering now, is it going to be more of the same, during the fall semester? Well, if you are having an experience that's not so good, maybe the teacher's not grading your assignments, which is really frustrating because, you did all this work and there's no grade. Just realize that the SAT or ACT are definitely going to give you a grade, so to speak. There's a definite outcome. So realizing that there are good benchmarks for the SAT and ACT creates motivation, right? I know the target I'm after. I want to get into this really good school. I want to get into a good state school, NC State, Duke, UNC Greensboro, UNC Wilmington, App State, or I want to get into South Carolina. And I know what my score needs to be so I can go after it with a clear conviction, right? So think about the returns on investment. If you're going to put in that time on the SAT, ACT, think about, I want you to visualize, as Dr. Ari said, create a vision. I mean that literally. I sometimes tell my students, imagine getting that acceptance letter, you know, from Chapel Hill, opening that letter for that dream college you've always wanted to go to, and how good that would feel, right? Imagine that. Imagine being there with your friends. Imagine being there with opportunities, great people, great professors, learning skills. I'm going to have a career. It's very exciting, isn't it? And to think that could be connected to this process of test prep, that makes it a much more exciting thing to get involved in. Also remember, as Amy said, scholarship money, folks. You know, it's not about just getting over the bar and getting in to the school you want. It's getting to the next level and getting some of that scholarship money. And Dr. Ari and I have both helped lots of students get lots of money from just students who were committed the way many of you are and want to see a better future. And just realize that test prep can open that door for you to get very, very substantial funding. And then think about your college experience. If you have good funding, you can go, relax, read, study at your own pace, go to a coffee shop. You're not having to work a job, you know, to make ends meet during college. So that's another wonderful outcome that could be a result of you getting serious about some test prep. So again, the advice I give to students with all the test cancellations, it's another frustrating thing. Some of you have had your SAT canceled, your ACT canceled, is double down on prep during this time. Don't give up. Why? Think about it as a second opportunity, right? You just got, what if I said, hey, your chemistry test is tomorrow, and you come in and the teacher says, hey, we had to cancel it. You're going to take it next Monday. Now go study some more. Well, you might be frustrated that they canceled it, but you think, well, I'm struggling in this class. I could use some extra time, right? Oh, what a relief. So now it's time to double down. They will solve this. The College Board will solve this. The ACT will solve this. We will solve this as a society together. We're going to take measures, mitigations, you know, whatever it takes, distancing, masks to get through the COVID challenge. But when that happens, you're going to be ready for it. Yeah. Also remember that many of the test optional schools even are only going to be test optional for a year. So the time is now to take advantage of this time to be ready for next year. So consider the COVID time as a time to double down and really drive that score higher than it ever would have been. And I think you'll be very grateful that you did that. Next slide, please. Okay, so who's going to do test cancellations? Is that you, Dr. Ari? I think you're muted.
I'll pick up the vein from Al and talk a little bit more about the test cancellations. All our students are having this doubt in their minds, like, I'm putting all this effort, will my test end up getting canceled? And the answers are not yet clear in the age of COVID. What I will tell you though is there is a huge backlog of students who need to test. This cancellation started from March. And after that, you know, people have been, you know, working on it, but they're not being able to get tested. So I would say the College Board and ACT, if you look at what they're doing, they're adding more tests. Now, in the next slide, we'll see the different test sets till the end of this year. But in general, the idea is to flood the market with tests. Some of these companies are going to test more than once every month. And the reason all these cancellations are happening, a couple of reasons. One, test centers are entirely getting closed, some of them. But then some of them are also doing social distancing and putting people far apart. So that way the capacity reduces dramatically. So I would say sign up early in case they decide to increase the social distance between students taking the test. The ones who signed up early have a better chance of staying in, and the ones who sign up kind of late, close to the deadline, they may be pushed back to future tests. And while you're going through these uncertain times, my suggestion is dig in and stay on the study or prep wagon, it's very important to keep yourself sharp and not lose that focus. A lot of these tests are psychological victories. When you get a good score, it's not just because of your foundation or strategy. It's also because you are mentally ready on the day of the test to actually go through the rigor. Because both Dr. Al and I, we have noticed students who do well on certain days and don't do so well on other days. When they're focused, they do well. When they are not focused, didn't get a good night's sleep, or whatever reason, not feeling well, they don't do so well. So get your mental preparedness in the best possible form. Another very looked away from point is the percentiles look much better during the pandemic, because for the same score, you're going to have fewer people competing with you at that score bracket. A lot of students who were supposed to be getting good scores or who could get good scores in normal times, during these times, they have kind of slacked up. And if you are not a slacker, if you actually work hard for your tests now, this is once in a lifetime opportunity to improve your percentiles dramatically. And that also means that people like Amy and Faith, they're going to select your application way over other people's applications, but scores don't look so good. Set your motivation and goals. I think both of us, we've been talking about motivations and goals because that's your Duracell bunny. It has to keep drumming on. And take the standardized tests. Do not listen to rumors and sensational editorials and op-eds saying that, oh, the SAT is cracked, we are finally done with it. I put on the hat of a college admissions group as well at UNC Charlotte. And when I look at applications, I cannot just trust people's GPAs, because I just don't have the time to do research on all the different schools we get applications from. So within a few minutes that I am with that application, my eyes always stray to the possibility of looking up a SAT or ACT score. And there's always, you're dealing with human beings. They're going to, as long as they're not test blind, they're going to take a sneak peek at that. So you need to look good with your scores there. Next slide. So just a side-by-side comparison and some news about these tests. Cost-wise, you are pretty comparable. Of course, for students who need fee waivers, they're available. You just need to write to them. You can find testing centers and the registration dates and deadlines for the SAT on College Board. For the ACT, you go to act.org. And these are some of the test dates that have been already published. Now, what the new thing that is happening, quite a few new developments in the area of ACT from the September 12th test. They are going to go into computer testing, which means you go to a test center and you'll be given a computer, much like what you see at the DMV, to sit down and take a test on the computer. Towards the end of 2020, they have a plan to go to remote testing. That plan is still a pilot plan. All the plans I'm talking about, including the computer testing, is a pilot plan. For the remote testing plan, you will not be required to go to a test center. You can just log into the testing website with your password, and there will be a remote proctor proctoring you as you take the test on screen. This pilot project is expected to roll out end of 2020 and beginning of 2021. And then finally, section retesting, where you don't have to actually take all 4 sections of the ACT, but choose your own sections to test, which is meant to help students out. That has been pushed back by about a year. So maybe fall of 2021 at the earliest. Similar to the ACT, the SAT is also coming up with a plan for remote testing and remote proctoring. These are new developments in the testing world because we live in the age of COVID. Faith?
All right, that brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much to our presenters for all of that wonderful information. It was very helpful to all of the students, I'm very sure. So like I said earlier, if you have any questions, go to the bottom of your screen and look for that Q&A button and send in the questions. I know we already have some already, so let me stop screen share and we will go ahead and take a look at some of these questions. Okay, someone has asked, what is a low SAT or ACT score? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I'll take it. This is the answer you're going to hear through many different admissions topics, and that is it depends. It depends on the school that you're looking for at. It depends on what your goal is with the SAT or ACT. Some schools, an average or mid-range SAT or ACT score might be, a 980 to a 1030 for the SAT, or a mid-20 score. But if you're looking at maybe an Ivy League school, or you're looking at a higher kind of end school, that range could look like a 1500 to a 1600. It's just going to depend on where you're looking. There's no such thing as a standard low score, high score. It's, like I said, it very much fluctuates.
If I may add a bit to what Amy just said, I have found a good resource to look for your college's score requirement would be to go on College Board and look up the colleges that you may be interested in, and you will get the entire list of previous year's range as well as median scores in the SAT and ACT. That will help you set your goals.
Absolutely. Okay, next question is, do you think they will cancel the August SAT due to the pandemic?
What I would say about that is that the College Board last year took proactive measures and canceled, entire national test dates. The ACT they did cancel 1 or 2 dates, but then the last one they let regions do it. And so some regions had it, some regions canceled, some testing centers canceled. I had students in Charlotte who went to South Carolina to take the test, so they had some open centers. So you're going to have to go region by region. We don't know what the College Board will decide with the SAT. We're all hoping that they find a way to trust the testing centers to make good judgments, based on the local conditions, because we know that COVID-19 is different all over the country in different places. There could be hot spots that perhaps will cancel, other places that won't. So it might be a good idea for you to start thinking about alternative test sites if that's possible. As I said, some of my students had their ACTs canceled last month and were immediately able to transfer to another center in South Carolina. So I don't know if that'll happen with the SAT, but I'm hoping that it will be decided on a regional basis and not on a national basis. That's something to just watch out for and keep track on the SAT College Board website.
Great, thank you. Next question, what should our timeline look like now considering COVID-19? I've only been able to take the ACT once and I haven't taken the SAT yet, and I'm already heading into my senior year.
I would say focus on the test that you have already taken and you're familiar with. Don't try anything new for the senior year, and plan to be in this test prep mode till December of 2020, and keep watching out for opportunities to be able to take your test on one of these dates. The last slide we presented had a test in the SAT area for every single month. ACT had multiple equal number of tests as well, if not more, from now till the end of this year. So keep registering, and you don't have to pay extra fees for if your test gets delayed or canceled. They will automatically move your registration over to the next date. And like Dr. Al said, people are going out of state. Some of my students have gone to Tennessee and Georgia, besides South Carolina, when they lost their seat in North Carolina and they were able to test elsewhere. So the main thing here is, which is fortunately under your control, is you and your mindset. So stay in the game and you will always find an opportunity to test somehow. Not to mention the fact that towards the end of this year, I believe, and I don't have any insider information, but I believe that both the SAT and ACT will end up coming up with a remote testing format.
I would add one thing to that, and I completely agree with what Dr. Ari is saying. In general, you should lock down on one test and master it. Don't try to master both the SAT and ACT because it's sort of wasting your resources. Having said that, given that you're a senior, you might consider, when are your deadlines? What schools are you applying to, and when are the deadlines? Find out those deadlines. If you are in a crunch, one thing that works in your favor, they revamped and redeveloped the SAT 4 years ago, right? They totally overhauled the test. And what was good about that is that they made it resemble the ACT much more. So now the tests are very similar with some important differences, especially on timing, right? So the SAT does give you more time. Now, given that you've taken the ACT, it might make sense for you to go take an SAT. Since you've been trained on the more rapid timing for the ACT, you might take the SAT and go, oh, wow, this feels great. I've got more time now. So some of my students, I do prep classes in both SAT and ACT. Some students will take my SAT class, take the SAT, and then say, well, what could it hurt? I'll take an ACT as well. Boom. And then they knock that out of the park as well, because the skills can translate over. So, and the same thing with my ACT students. I'll take an ACT and then go hit an SAT, boom, and hit a nice big increase on both tests. So given that you're under a crunch, I might say, consider slipping in that SAT on August 29th, because it couldn't hurt you, to go ahead and get an extra test date in. If you had time, I would say focus on one test, as Dr. Ari says. But I would just add that extra piece of advice, given the crunch you might be in as a senior.
Thank you. This question says, let's say your GPA weighted is a 4.5. You have a lot of dual enrollment classes, you have a number of extracurriculars, and you have an SAT score of 1300. Should you submit it or go test optional?
I'll answer that from the admissions perspective. Again, like I said earlier, it's gonna depend on the school. For some schools, that SAT range might be a great fit given your academic profile. For others, it might not be. So do your research. I would highly recommend keeping a spreadsheet with all of this information on it. It has deadlines, it has scholarship information, it has mid-range SAT, ACT scores, mid-range GPA scores. But you're going to have to do your research. It's just going to fluctuate school by school. I will say most admissions reps are pretty upfront. So reach out to us, reach out to those at the schools that you're interested in. Someone in admissions will at the very least send you their mid-ranges. I at least have a policy with students who are curious for my school where I'll say yay or nay on a score. If you send me your score, I'll say that'll help you or it won't. So do your research, reach out to the colleges. It's going to very much fluctuate school by school.
Thank you. Next question says, hello, I just started studying for the SAT about a month ago, and I will be a junior in the fall. I plan to take the SAT in September. Is there any books you'd recommend?
Well, the most obvious thing would be to take the official guide for the SAT. It's a book in a printed form, but the tests are actually available on College Board's website or on Khan Academy itself. So I would not personally buy the book. I would just download the test, because other than the tests, there is very little material in the reading, writing, and the math sections in that particular book. So if you need to build up foundations in these areas, again, there are all these resources we mentioned in the set of slides. Khan Academy is a good resource. There are plenty of resources from other test prep companies. These are all free resources which you can find on the internet, and then gradually build up your knowledge base in the different areas. One thing to keep in mind is none of these tests, and by that I mean the SAT as the ACT for the undergrad admissions, as well as GRE, GMAT, LSAT for the graduate level admissions, they do not actually publish a syllabus. So you don't know exactly what is the finite set of things you need to study. So the best way to study is to go through a lot of past questions in this test. And when you get those questions and you try to answer them, they typically come with answers, not necessarily with explanations. So if you're just doing this on your own, you have to reverse engineer the solution. And those questions ultimately give you an idea of the kind of the breadth of the test and the depth of the test that you might be encountering.
I would add to that, that if you are thinking about a book, chime in on what Dr. Ari says, definitely stick with the official guide. This is the official SAT study guide. I don't know if you can see my image here or not, but it's the official SAT study guide from College Board. It's got 8 full practice SATs in it. As I said before, these are mostly real SATs. I think a couple of them were designed as practice, but most of them were actually used in the last couple of years. And as Dr. Ari says, there are now 8 of these tests on the College Board website. Here's what I would say though. If you do decide to take them off the website for free, which is great, print them off and work them in pencil, and then go back with a red pen or a blue pen or green pen. Look at the answer explanations, target what did I do wrong on this question, and make a really clear diagnosis. As I said, start to capture those questions in your learning log is what I call it, where you have all the different categories of questions missed. And then you go back. The reason I'm saying this is so important, to use your book as the review process, going back through those questions you missed, and seeing splashes of red where you missed questions, and I can rapidly see, oh, these are the problems, these are the techniques I need to master. So I'm a big believer in printing things off and not just taking tests online and sort of letting them go, once you miss them. So keep a record of the ones you missed by either printing off the test or getting the book. It's only like $20. That's the one I would use for SAT.
Great. See, we have a little bit more time, so we'll try and get through these last few questions. But it says, my school is giving out a non-reportable ACT without the writing part in the math and science. Could the concordance score go on my applications for college, even though it's not the whole test?
Again, that's going to fluctuate college to college. I hate to keep saying this, but this is where doing your research really comes into play. Some colleges want every single score from every single test. Some colleges want that, but the admissions officers don't see them. Some colleges don't necessarily want that. So it's really going to be dependent on the college. For a question that specific, I would highly recommend reaching out and at least emailing the general college admissions office email for that institution, if not the kind of person who works with your area.
Great. Someone asked, would you repeat when ACT will be online? We have already paid for the test, but it has been canceled twice.
So this term online is quite confusing. Let me use slightly different terms. So ACT has a couple of options, which both of them could be termed online. The first one, which is normally called online, is where you go to the test center. You sit down at a computer like you do at a DMV, and you log into the test with your credentials, and you go and take the test. That, as of now, is slated to start on a pilot basis of starting with the September 12th ACT. We don't know, fingers crossed, right? Then the next thing, which goes by the name of online, which I really like them to move forward with, because the COVID, in my opinion, is going to stay for a while, is what they call the remote testing. In remote testing, you log into your own computer from your home. You don't actually go anywhere. So that immediately cuts out chances of any kind of uncertainty and cancellations. So you stay logged into a website with your credentials, and there's a remote proctoring that happens. A certain proctor can oversee, like say 50 students. And the proctor, there are advanced software that we use in the university for remote proctoring of students for their finals as well. So this would be similar software. So what I'm trying to say is that the technology exists. There needs to be a willpower now to implement them. And I understand the difficulties. Even with so many participants today, we are still having some internet glitches here and there. So there will be stuff like that needs to be sorted out. This perhaps is not for everyone. But the remote testing is probably the solution, a good bulwark against the COVID. That is slated to pilot end of fall, beginning of 2021 as of now. So these are the two online testings. Now, my guess is once ACT starts doing that, College Board is not going to be far behind because they will lose students to them. So if one starts the very next month, you'll see the next one starting.
Great, thank you. What if I do good at reading scores, but I can't pass the math scores, and I keep trying over and over again, but I still can't get the score I want?
Well, this is a common challenge for a lot of students. And this goes back to what I was saying. Are you just taking the test over and over again, sort of like hitting a brick wall, or do you have a system in place for review? And again, math is a particularly strong element of Khan Academy, right? Khan Academy is a fantastic resource. So what you need to be doing is when you miss one, say, what kind of question is that? Is that geometry? Is that algebra? Is that a quadratic? You know, what is it? Try to name it, okay? And take a piece of paper and write, you know, geometry, or write circles. I keep missing circle questions. And just keep a list of these terms and write those question numbers down all underneath it. Then jump over to Khan Academy, right? And type in circle theorems. Go to YouTube, type circle theorems. There's a 5-minute video. Hey kids, here's how you do that, right? And do that systematic review using Khan Academy of all those areas, and then here's the important thing. I can't stress this enough. After you've done some review, before you do another test or another practice test, go back through all those questions again, rapid, you know, in sequence in your book, and just drill them into your head. Okay, I get it, circles. Now let's do some more practice questions. Whoa, there's a circle question, nailed it. See what I mean? So put that system in place, and that's really gonna work to bring your math score up. And use either Khan Academy website or YouTube. A lot of Khan Academy videos are on YouTube, but you gotta be systematic about it, okay?
Awesome. What should I do if I can't take a test before fall admissions and colleges still require it?
This is where I have to just say some bad news for you. If you can't take a test, but it's a requirement for admissions to the institution looking at, you can't apply to that institution. You can reach out and see if they would potentially wait for a late score. Some institutions can do that, some can't. But if you don't have the admissions requirements, you don't have the admissions requirements. But the good news is there are over 5,000 schools out there. Surely there's another one that would be a good fit for you that either is test flexible, test optional, test blind, those 4 that are test blind. But if you don't have what you need to apply to that school, you don't have what you need to apply to that school. You know, there's also a great option if this is really your dream school of doing, you know, community college for a year and maybe transferring in, taking a gap year so you can study, prepare for the test, train for the test. I like that phrase. And get prepared for the next cycle. But reach out to the schools, see if they'll grant you an exception. Most likely they won't. And you then need to revisit your list.
And I would add to that, many schools are making these announcements like just last week that they're going test optional, and they were required 2 weeks ago. You know what I mean? So because of the COVID crisis, there's some schools that you're thinking, oh no, they're required, and they might go test optional next week. So don't write them off. Keep asking, hey, is there any chance you could go test optional just for this year? Because that's precisely why they're doing it, is to help students like you who got kind of burned on the COVID cancellations, and now you don't have a test. And a lot of schools, big schools, are going test optional for this year just to help students like you. So keep asking. Don't just write them off until you've gotten all the information.
Yes, and the news, I cannot emphasize enough how quickly and rapidly this is changing. I want to say in the last hour and a half, the UNC system decided to go test optional for this year, and that has been in the last hour and a half. So keep an eye out, because what might be the answer this morning is potentially not the answer tomorrow morning. And I'm not saying that then you should bank on this, but keep in mind that things will be changing.
Definitely. This next question is kind of similar. It says, what if tests start getting canceled, but you're applying early action? Do you just not submit anything? Will that be worse for us in regards to admissions?
So if the school is test optional, and I say given this very uncertain time of timing right now, I think it'll be held a little bit less as a factor if, again, just for this specific set of circumstances. If you can't get your scores in before the early action deadline and the school is test optional, so that's a little bit different than the previous question of it requires tests, but they don't have them yet, then you're probably okay. But I would, if you then do take the test later, if it's before decisions are released, reach out to the school and say, hey, I got this score, I'd like to add it to my application. It's not going to hurt you if the school is test optional. I will say that again. But if you do then take the test, get a strong score, I would absolutely recommend submitting it later.
Next question. Do you suggest you take the ACT and the SAT and put them both on your college applications, or do you need to take one test?
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Amy, did you want to say something first? Ladies first.
Okay, so if you take which one, if you have time to take both, because it allows you, as Dr. Al and Dr. Arya said, to figure out which one you might be stronger in. So if you take both and you have strong scores in both, go for it. If you take both and you have strong scores in one and not the other, focus your efforts on that one. Some schools will require that you submit every single score. For every single test that you take. Some very prestigious schools will require that, so keep that in mind. You might not have that option, but you're gonna it's gonna be up kind of your sense of which one you're stronger at.
Did you want to add something to that, Dr. Ari? Because I had a thought.
I agree completely with Amy. If you're a rising senior and you do not have time to try out both the tests, and let's say you have good scores in both, submit both. If you have good score in one, submit that one, work on it so that you don't have to learn anything new. However, if you are, say, a rising junior and you have a whole year ahead of you, it might not be a bad idea to try out both the tests. If you get strong scores in both, 2 is always better than 1, because the admissions officer who is going to take a sneak peek at 1 score is going to take a look at 2 scores. And we like to see people with 2 scores which are better, which are both good compared to 1 score. Although officially they will never ask for both the scores. But remember, you're dealing with human beings. They're very subjective. So that's to keep in mind. If you have time, work on both, see if you can get both the scores up. If you don't have time and you have done good work on one, or you have time only to invest in one, then just submit 1 score. It's not going to be that much of an impact.
And the only thing I would add is that it's good to take them both at the start of your prep cycle. You know, take both to get a feel for both, evaluate both, see your strengths and weaknesses. And then, as we've all been saying, master one of the tests. Just go do the prep on that test. Of course, it never hurts to just jump over and take another test if you have a test date to take it on without going into all the prep for that test, right? It can't hurt you as long as the skills translate over. The other thing I would say is that if you're submitting both scores to an institution, I think most admissions counselors, and I would let Amy and Faith speak to this, if you have 2 pretty good scores, an SAT and an ACT, most counselors would rather say 1 really high SAT or 1 really high ACT than 2 pretty good scores. Is that accurate? So you're better off to master and just knock one out of the park if you can get that lined up. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So master 1 test.
Well, we're just past 11 o'clock, so I'll ask one more question, and I think it'll be a pretty easy answer for everyone. But should we still take the test even if the school we want to apply to has gone test optional?
That is an emphatic yes, because even if the school is test optional, that doesn't mean merit scholarships are test optional. Keep that in mind. Do your research. Very few schools actually have test optional merit scholarships, even if the school is test optional. So that's absolutely going to be a factor. You don't want to limit yourself. You don't want to make a decision right now because you don't want to take the test. You don't want to prepare for the test. That's going to limit your options later. There's no harm in taking it. There's no harm in getting prepared for that test, and it can only open doors for you as well.
And I would just add to that, you know, it's not that of course it won't harm you and it can only benefit you, but as we've all been saying with one voice, it will absolutely benefit you if you can turn in a good score. It's not even a question. If the school's gone test optional, that still means do it. Effectively, unless there's a good reason not to turn the score in. Unless you have a good reason not to turn it in. You're not a good test taker. That's really, really, really low compared to your other GPAs, and you don't have the ability or the time to get prepped on it. Sure, then you can hold back. But if you can take advantage of the time, it's absolutely in your benefit. You know, not just sort of a why not, but absolutely is what I would say. Yeah.
All right, well, that brings us to the end. Does anyone have any last words they'd like to say, words of motivation to students? Anything before we close out?
I'd like to throw out there that yes, the SAT, the ACT, and this kind of grand concept seems like a big thing. It seems a little bit scary. And it feels sometimes like that number is going to make or break your life. I will say that it's not, but it can be very helpful. The test is actually not that scary. You just take a deep breath. If you've prepared adequately before you go in, you're going to be okay. So don't let it become this big behemoth in your mind, but at least take the time to prepare because it can open a lot of doors for you.
And I would add to that very good advice, consider the SAT as a chance to learn a bunch of really good skills that are going to translate into other areas of life. You know what I mean? So, you know, you're reading these, both SAT and ACT have texts, you know, from great pieces of literature, science writing, social science writing, historical documents. You're going to learn to process and read and understand these things. And that's going to help you in college. You're going to be a way better reader, a way better test taker. You know, I get notes from students all the time at great universities and say, hey, it's been 3 years since I did prep with you. Thank you so much for making all my classes so much easier in college. So when you're prepping for SAT or ACT, don't think, well, I just got to get this stupid test out of the way. I'm just learning these skills and I'm going to forget them all. You won't, because the skills you're going to learn in mathematics, in science, in grammar, you're going to be a better writer, you're going to be a better reader. All of it is valuable and will translate into your study skills. It'll happen right now. You'll do better on your AP English test next semester after you prepare for the SAT. Whether you do it with a prep company or not, if you just get online and hammer it out, everything's going to get better. So think of it that way. It's a very good investment, you know, in your academic and intellectual future, for sure. And just the psychology of it. Hey, I did that, right? It's going to feel good when you get that score. So think of it as a challenge that way too.
And I'd like to add that in every vagary in life, you should look for an opportunity. None of the panelists sitting here today, did not have time like you guys have. We didn't have a COVID crisis when we were taking the SAT and ACT. Everyone is locked up in home. You can do what you want to do regularly. Online schooling, it is still going to leave you with a lot of excess time. You don't have to spend an hour traveling in the school bus. You'll be less tired taking online classes or partial rotations from home. So you got a whole bunch of time in your hands now. Use this time to get ahead of the crowd. Your percentiles will look way better this year for the same effort that somebody could have hoped for last year. So, you know, look for a silver lining in this cloud.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Amy, Dr. Al, Dr. Ari, for the wonderful information you've shared with all of us today, and Abe, who's been behind the scenes helping us out as well. That brings us to the end of our presentation on standardized testing, and I encourage you all to check your emails, look out for a webinar we have coming next week on resumes and activities lists, and then we have a few more in the weeks following that. But thank you so much for joining us today on this Thursday morning, and we will talk with you all soon. Have a good one.